In this video, I'll be talking about the last part of Robinson Crusoe. So the narrative really changes when he's walking on the beach and he comes across a single footprint. And he's more terrified at that than almost any other time in the novel. And he even says to himself, you think I'd be happy in finding, another human, but instead he's terrified. And so he tries to hide everything. He tries to build up a fortification. Instead of focusing on planting and producing, he completely changes what he's doing, and he does start to seem like a little unstable. So he doesn't see anybody else for a while, but at a certain point he does come to the beach and witnesses cannibals who have come over from another island, and they're eating people there. And he has this just two responses that I want to talk about. One is disgust, which is physical, because he's so overwhelmed with this emotion. This is sort of this moment of Cartesianism in the midst of a mostly Hobbesian narrative. He's so overwhelmed that he throws up. And then the other is his indignation over cannibalism. So the disgust response, I think, is really interesting, because I think it actually suggests, like, the obvious thing would be to say that the cannibals are the other and they horrify him. But I think what the disgust response suggests is that there's some way in which he identifies with them, because in order to be physically disgusted, he has to at least imagine himself eating someone else, because he throws up. And so there's some imagined food in him that has to come out. And so he has some kind of identification with these cannibals that is more disturbing than thinking of them as an other, to be distanced, to be totally have nothing to do with you. And the other emotional response that's always fascinating me is indignation, that he feels indignant at these cannibals. So, you could see like horror, ew, eating people, it's horrible. But why indignation? If we think back to Hobbes, like, what is indignation for? I mean, indignation is when somebody beneath you, like, gets out of line. But as he, and then he thinks about it and he thinks, well, actually, they're not really getting out of line to him. They're just eating each other. They're not actually at that point eating him. And I mean, at no point do they eat him, but they're not eating, they're not threatening him. And they're, at least at that point, they're not eating anyone he identifies with, any of his countrymen, any of his co-religionists. They're not eating any Christians. They're just eating each other. And so he kind of talks himself down from that. But I think the indignation is interesting, because it does, to me, it suggests two sort of bizarre things that I don't know quite what to do with. But one of them is, again, a kind of identification with cannibals, that if he's indignant, that they're somehow, offending him by eating other cannibals. And the other response that I think is interesting about indignation is it kind of suggests to me that the cannibals are violating a rule that everybody would violate if they didn't restrain themselves. And so if you, nowadays, if you see somebody who's not wearing a mask and you're wearing a mask, you might be indignant because, you don't want to wear this thing on your face, but you do it because to be part of, a healthy society, and you do it for other people as well as for yourself. And they're violating those rules kind of selfishly. So indignation to me almost suggests that, well, like, why don't I get to be a cannibal if, you know, if you're going to be a cannibal? So, not quite sure what to do with that. But that is the word he uses, the word Defoe uses to describe Robinson's emotional reaction is indignation. So he does ultimately, at that moment, decide not to kill them. And the reason is that he's thinking, you know, at first he says, I'm really indignant. How dare they? I'm going to go kill them. And then when he parses it out rationally, he comes to decide that their actions really don't have anything to do with him, that they're not a direct offense to him because they're because in their culture he comes to decide that this is not a crime. And then he starts to wonder, well, why does God reveal these values to some people and not to others? And he can't figure that out. And to me, what's interesting about that is that even though this narrative is very much about kind of the reasons to be a Christian, there's like a lot of doubt that is raised through the whole time. And this is one of those moments. These cannibals attacking people who you know, don't want to be eaten, and he identifies with the victims in that situation, and instead of staying out of it, he, you know, helps Friday along, and he had dreamed about Friday before, and, you know, that's gotten a lot of attention. It's really fascinating. I'll just say that Robinson knows, and this is what he says, he can't ever get off the island without the help of someone like Friday. So, and this does reflect the way Europeans integrated themselves into North and South America, is that they were never successful without the help of natives. Most of the wars they fought against native peoples were, they were allied with rival native people. And so that, you know, that was true with Cortez, that was true in North America as well. And so he realizes that he cannot possibly survive without befriending someone like Friday. So he does, and he's successful. And that there's been so much written about Robinson Crusoe and Friday. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but, you know, it's a wonderful part of the narrative. Friday is a lot younger than Robinson Crusoe, and Robinson Crusoe does save him, and he does say kind of at one point that everybody on the island is somebody whose life he saved, so they're all obligated to him. And this is also Lockean, you know, that Locke argues that the only legitimate reason for making somebody your slave is if you could have killed them and you spared their life, and then they'll be enslaved to you rather than be killed. So this is you know, these aren't people who he has purchased in some sort of slave market, and this is a kind of distinction that would be made in certainly made in the novel, and it's made in the 18th century. Robinson and Friday become friends. Is Friday a slave? You know, I don't know. If you do a word search, you'll see like maybe like twice he's called a slave, but he's more often called a servant. And when they do get off the island, Robinson actually hires a servant for Friday. He recognizes that Friday can no longer be a servant because he doesn't know anything about European ways, and he needs his own servant. So they do kind of, it's not a clear relationship. It's not a clear relationship of a kind of racial domination. There are other factors as well, because Robinson is much older and he saves Freddy's life. On the other hand, you could say that Defoe, who's making up the story, narrates it so that it turns out that way, and that particular relationship is justified because of the way the whole thing is set up. And then, what does this narrative tell us about colonialism? This is much debated, so I'll just say a little bit about that. So, on the one hand, there are ways in which Robinson Crusoe, the novel, clearly sets the stage for European colonialism. A lot of the fascination and pleasure of the narrative is Robinson himself cultivating the land and claiming possession of it. He definitely thinks of the island as his own, as we see at the end. It's his island, and he thinks of himself as the king of it, although that could be sort of a parody. But there is this sense in which in England there's only a finite amount of land, and land is associated with wealth, because if you own land you could charge people rent. Land is crucial. Of course, this is something we lose touch with in our world, but certainly in Defoe's world, land was crucial for producing food. And so if there's no land, there's no food. So land is incredibly valuable for human sustenance. So this argument that a suggestion that you could get from reading this novel is that if the resources in England are tapped out, there are other opportunities for you to go find some prosperity somewhere else. So you could get that out of reading this. And of course, Robinson himself makes huge profits from his plantation in Brazil. So that's another argument in favor of colonialism in this novel. On the other hand, Robinson himself never had any desire to settle on that island. He just ends up there, and he definitely does not want to be there. He calls it the island of despair. So you could say reading this narrative would be quite a disincentive to take part in any voyage of exploration or colonial project because of all the really awful things that happened to him. The older Robinson Crusoe clearly thinks of himself as having been wrong in his youth. He was wrong to leave his parents. He left them vulnerable. He broke their trust. He was an unworthy son. And the whole voyage was not an honorable project or a moral project or a project that is recommended. And he's selfish and he's greedy. The only, I guess, silver lining is that when he is forced to be all by himself, he does have a kind of spiritual awakening, and he gets in touch with a kind of inner part of himself that he didn't have access to in his earlier part of his life. So there is a kind of redemption for him, but the redemption only comes after he's been a terrible person, basically, which is what the older Robinson will clearly admit, and will say that he, deserved his suffering. So there is some celebration, I think, in this of human labor and creativity, because once he's brought to that desperation in the island, he comes up with some really interesting ways of taking care of himself. So that perhaps could argue in favor of colonialism, or as this novel supporting colonialism, but it's not entirely clear. So I also then in the end want to return to this question of whether or not Friday is a slave, and whether or not this novel promotes slavery. which is an interesting question too, and also not easily answered, just like colonialism. So, of course, in popular culture, Friday is often represented as Black, as an African, but of course he's not. He's a native Caribbean. He's indigenous to the Caribbean area. He's not from Africa at all. He's not a Christian. He does submit to Robinson. You know, he more than once he puts his head under his foot in this clear signal of, you know, I'm the slave and you're the master, or I'm the servant, however you want to put it. And he is, like we've seen in other slave narratives, given a new name. I mean, his mother didn't give him the name Friday, and he is the one who learns English rather than Robinson learning his language. And also the whole thing about cannibalism, this is clearly a great fear of Europeans. I mean, I think it has a really particular and fascinating conjunction of emotional issues in Robinson Crusoe, but it is also kind of a justification for European superiority and European horror at other people. So, but to return to Friday in particular, there's definitely some affection between Robinson and Friday, however you want to interpret it. There's been a lot of discussion of that, and Robinson does try to convert Friday to Christianity. But this is also really kind of interesting, because if you look at it closely, Friday is willing to be converted, but he's also pretty skeptical of Christianity, and he asks Robinson some questions that are too hard for him. And he says, like, at a certain point, he says, you know, well, if God's so powerful, why doesn't he just kill the devil? And Robinson, like, doesn't know the answer to that, and so he pretends he didn't hear it. And I don't know, I think it's really funny. And so there's definitely some promotion of Christianity, but at the same time some rather comical skepticism that never really gets answered sufficiently in the novel. It just kind of is left there. So I don't know if Friday really becomes a Christian. I don't know if Robinson really becomes a Christian. I don't know. I think there's a strain of skepticism that is never fully extirpated in the narrative. And then one final way to think about whether or not Friday's a slave is if Friday had a child, would that child be enslaved? And that's one of the earmarks of you know, chattel slavery, is that it's inherited. And I can't imagine that Friday's child would be enslaved. But again, we don't know what happens. And by the way, I should actually mention that the narrative that you read is one part of a 3-part full Robinson Crusoe, because there's a Robinson Crusoe Further Adventures, and then there's a third one that's like Robinson Crusoe's Meditations. And the second one's really fascinating. Like he goes back out again, and he goes to China, and he takes Friday with him at the beginning, but then Friday dies, and he's really, really upset. And so they're really, in part 2, they become companions, really, more than the master and slave relationship. So I think ultimately one of the reasons why there's so much discussion of this novel and it's lasted so long is that it leaves so many open questions, and it isn't simply, you know, one thing or the other. It's every time you think of one argument that it's, you know, promotes colonialism, you could think of a reason it undercuts it, and so it's a continually fascinating novel.